Hello and welcome. This is Business Edge right here on News Central. I'm Tolulope Adeleru Balogun. Before we get into our conversations today, first, the headlines. South Africa to start another, which is its third investment conference. And Morocco records trade deficit of 22.2% as of September 2020. And later on in the show, we'll be wrapping things up with NC4 to watch. This is Business Edge on News Central. Welcome. And let's get into our first story, where South Africa has announced that it plans to host a third investment conference with an eye on jobs and COVID recovery. The country is going ahead with its hosting of its third investment conference that will hold on the 17th and 18th of November 2020. And this comes as the country focuses on reconstruction in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. According to the minister in the presidency, Jackson Mthembu, this year's South African Investment Conference will focus on the delivery of existing commitments to realize job creation and economic development. He added that in addition, governments will highlight actions taken to foster a conducive investment environment with a focus on economic reconstruction and recovery. The minister told the media during a briefing on the outcomes of the cabinet meeting that was held on Wednesday. He further said that the conference aims to build on the successes of the last two conferences, which raised 664 billion rand, which also laid a foundation for investment and accelerated economic growth. And joining me to discuss this, I have an International Tax Justice Academy member, as well as the current tax advisor at Action Aid in South Africa, and that is Mtwalo Msoni. Good afternoon. Hello, can you hear me, Mtwalo?
Yes, I can hear you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us on Business Edge. So let's look at what South Africa is saying. They're saying that they're hosting a third investment conference, building on the successes of the previous two. The government calls it successful. Looking at the current state of South Africa's economy and its finances, would you say those past two investment conferences were actually the success government claims?
Well, in terms of success, I should mention that they were successful in as much as raising some interest from investors to invest in the nation. But in terms of how much of those investment pledges has been realized is questionable. 6.5 billion rands was promised to be invested from the 2018 and 2019 investment conferences. But to the extent to which this 650 billion has been realized is quite questionable at this point. But I should mention that it will be a very good opportunity for the government to provide with investors what they are calling their economic recovery plan, which includes a progressive and more concrete plan in terms of infrastructure development, a plan in terms of how they would tend to reduce the unemployment rate, which was reported to stand at 42%, and also a comprehensive statement probably on the structural adjustments that would be expected in South Africa, considering the current context of the country being announced to be borrowing about $2.1 billion per day, and so on and so forth. So potentially this will be an opportunity for the government, for the cabinet to present some of the structural adjustments that it sees to be best suited for the investments to come in country. Of course, we do know that last week, the Minister of Finance, Tito Mboweni, announced that they would look at addressing the debt problem, the budget deficits that are there, and the projection is by 2022, 2023, we would see South Africa having surplus. So this is very important for them to try to look at having a discussion with these investors who've said we're going to bring in 650 billion rands in the country, and we are going to help you reduce your employment and your growth problems.
Okay, it's interesting because we know that as a continent, we see that Africa is losing actually on FDI, and that is foreign direct investment. A report from June, and that's even really before we had analyzed how much heavy losses would come from the coronavirus. The UNCTAD had already said that investment flows into Africa were going to drop about 25% to 40%. We know some of the destinations, the prime destinations are Nigeria, South Africa, Rwanda. So we are all losing a chunk of that foreign direct investment that's coming in. How do you think this investment conference can sort of stem that tide in terms of the chunk of FDI that South Africa may lose?
Of course, the trend in FDI loss has been there before even the coronavirus started. It's been exacerbated by the coronavirus. There's more FDI that's been projected to be lost that was supposed to come through. But an investment conference in itself provides a platform for the government to try to spark confidence from the investors, because they'll be awarded with an opportunity to present and make an argument of the country having a stable economic environment, of a country having to do away with debt problems, with poor credit ratings, and the country can actually prove through an investment conference that they actually have the ability to help these investors generate the much needed profits from the amounts that they've been pledging to bring into the country. So I think this broadly provides an opportunity for a country to make an argument that the favorable investment environment, of course, they are Africa's largest economy. 16% of Africa's GDP comes from South Africa. So they have got a very good argument and a very good platform for them to actually say that we have these structural adjustment programs in place, and the investment environment is flexible and your investments will be secured.
Okay, so you're talking about having the structural environments in place and things being secure. But as you mentioned earlier, the minister, Tito Mboweni, last week said that there's the potential that South Africa could default on its loans. Now, preparing for an international investment conference, looking to bring investors into the country, and then investors hearing the potential for the country to default on its loans, where do we balance that conversation? How would that play into the thinking of an investor who might be interested in South Africa?
Well, of course, a decline in credit rating, debt problems do lower investor confidence in the country. But as a comfort zone is that South Africa had announced that it has got a robust recovery plan where it's looking about cutting some of its expenditure in the years to come so as to reduce that debt burden. It has got a plan on how it's going to invest and try to see how a presidential fund can help reduce some of the unemployment problems that are there. And essentially, I think the South African government needs to take lots of time to explain some of its structural adjustments, some of its plans for future investments in country, and gaining the confidence of investors will be a very big part of the conference. But if I'm to call the shots, I think the South African government did make mention in details in the midterm expenditure framework on how they plan to curtail some of these problems that are there that would reduce the credit rating, that would reduce inflows of foreign direct investment. And this is what the country would seek to build on going forward with the conference.
Okay, so like many African countries, the debt issue is there, the borrowing issue is there. Many Africans across the continent have asked governments to also reduce the cost of governance. And many believe that this is an area many African countries have failed to actually adequately put their attention on. They're looking to increase VAT. We're hearing here in Nigeria that the Minister of Finance says they may increase VAT by 2%, trying to widen the tax net across the continent. But what do we say about the cost of governance across the continent? Specifically looking at South Africa now, we had situations involving South African Airways, massive bailouts there. We had situations as well with Eskom, massive bailouts. And these are things that make governance and make the economy as it is heavy, and they make it very draining on the finances of the country. So what do we do in terms of encouraging governments to be more creative in terms of their own costs to the economy, and also looking at some of these inbuilt costs that you have with such state entities like Eskom and South Africa Airways?
I think the problem with state entities not being profitable yet getting a big chunk of government resources is a problem across the African continent. And I think countries need to then do a comprehensive review on how they try to approach and bail out these state-owned enterprises. Of course, for South Africa, it was expected that South African Airways would receive another bailout chunk, but more resources, of course, need to be invested in ensuring that the entity remains relevant and contributes and not takes away from government coffers. Considering shortfalls in terms of domestic resource mobilization. You had mentioned the aspect of Nigeria looking at increasing its VAT, although it wasn't clear where the tax increases in South Africa will come from, but it's very predictable considering the increases in spending, at least for the year 2021, which are projected to come. So we're yet to see where those tax increases will come from. But with time, I think it will go down with reducing the expenditures for governments. South Africa, of course, is moving forward on a potential wage freeze for government workers, which is one avenue that they would consider do that. Very political, of course, would have lots of negative implications on the population, on the workers, on the motivation of the workers. But then with time, I think the plan is to try to see how they can cut expenditures for government and potentially drive away from bailing out state-owned enterprises and basically look at probably privatizing such entities or having more strict measures to actually ensure that these entities are actually operating at an optimal capacity.
Okay. Let's pause the conversation here. We're going to take a quick break, and it is interesting because South Africa and Nigeria constantly jostle for the largest economy in on the continent. Nigeria has held it for a few years now, but it doesn't mean that South Africa, of course, is relaxing on its oars in terms of working with employment, stabilizing electricity, which is a massive driver of development as well. Mtwalo, please stay with us. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back on Business Edge, we go from the southern part of the continent to the northern part of the continent, where Morocco is recording a trade deficit of 22.2% as of September 2020. This is unfortunate news for Morocco. We're going to go into the details of this and what the country can do to sort of reverse this trend. This is Business Edge on News Central. Stay with us. This is still Business Edge. Now, Morocco's trade deficit has plunged by 22.2% at the end of September 2020, standing at 120.4 billion Morocco dirham. The decline is due to a significant decrease in Morocco's capacity to import goods in the first 9 months of 2020. Equally, it recorded a slightly lower decline in goods exports. At the end of September, Morocco's imports stood at 307.5 billion Moroccan dirham, recording an annual decrease of 16.2%. Meanwhile, the country's exports declined by 11.8% and stood at 187.1 billion Moroccan dirham. Now, these figures mark a coverage rate of about 60.8%. The rate, which represents the Moroccan economy's global independence, improved by 3.0 basis points between September 2019 and September 2020. Also, the value of foreign direct investments recorded a 28.3% annual decline and stood at 10.81 billion Moroccan dirham at the end of September. So I still have Mtwalo Msoni with me, who is a member of the International Tax Justice Academy and a current tax advisor at Action Aid in South Africa. This Moroccan figures, Mtwalo, it's not necessarily so out of it. Many African countries and economies were already expecting to feel some very heavy losses in different areas due to the coronavirus. The number, 22.2%. Now let's focus on that. Is that number a lot more than we would expect given the current circumstances of the continent at large and then the greater world economy?
Well, there are different ways to look at it. And first of all, I think it's important to mention that Morocco has been recording trade deficits over the past 20 years. These deficits had been increasing in the early 2000s, and we had saw efforts by the Moroccan government to devaluate its currency to make its exports more attractive. We do know that Morocco exports predominantly citrus fruits, vegetables, semi-processed goods, and these are essentially what would be affected by a coronavirus pandemic, which would restrict the trade of goods and services. Morocco predominantly imports crude oil, of course, machinery, and some of the food products. We do know that most of its trade partners are Spain, Italy, and France. Spain actually accounts for 33% of Morocco's exports. So we should have expected that there should be a continuing trend of the trade deficit for Morocco, and because of oil prices, of course, we do expect that the cost of importation would be lower. And of course, because we can't export some of the fresh vegetables, fresh fruits that we have, this is where we have actually seen that there's been a decline in both the exports and imports. How that is playing out, of course, looks like Morocco is making headways on where it wants to be headed in terms of reducing a deficit from the deficit that it currently has for its balance of payments. But of course, most of this has been affected by the advent of the coronavirus, and also the fact that Morocco has seen some droughts, which means that it's producing less of cereals, less of wheat, which of course means they need to import more of that and export less of it. So this has been a play of exports and imports trying to balance out. Of course, we do know that the 6.2 decrease in imports has been slightly outweighed by about a 12% decrease in the exports that Morocco has had. The outlook, of course, for this still remains that Morocco will have a budget deficit, 7.5% of its GDP. Its economy is still expected to contrast at 5.8%, despite the increase in the reliance on the telecommunications and tourism sectors.
Okay, so you've taken us to the budget part of the conversation, which is where I was going next, in terms of how this would affect Morocco's budget financing. But then also a greater question. Again, we've seen over the past few years African economies trying to expand their tax nets, bringing in more of their citizens into the tax net so that they can have more internally generated revenue. Could we be seeing Morocco go the way of increase in taxation because it's attempting to deal with a budget that it may not be able to finance or does not have enough money as it would want, looking at all these numbers coming in?
In comparison to other African countries, I think Morocco is doing fairly well. And I think as the impacts of the coronavirus continue to decline, Morocco actually has an opportunity to work at its balance of payments and see how it can get more exports out of the country, and that would help generate revenue for the nation. I think there's lots of opportunity for growth for domestic resources, even without an increase in tax for Morocco, particularly considering the current growth that's also taking place in its tourism sector and its telecommunication sector. Of course, we do know that there's been a decline in terms of money that's coming into his tourism sector, but this is one particular aspect that has recorded actually a positive trade balance during this COVID period. We still have some people coming into Morocco, which are more than the people actually going out in terms of tourism expenditure.
Okay. Finally, very, very quickly, the question then is, what can Morocco do to see a boost in its revenues? As we talked about, drought has cost about 39% of their cereal harvest. Energy imports, including gas and oil, are also down as well. The automotive sector, which still continues to top its industrial exports, saw a drop in sales. In just one or two sentences, what can Morocco do to sort of stem this tide, or at least pause it? Again, it is a tide that many of us are expecting because of the impact of the coronavirus on international trade. But beyond that, countries have to be ready to do something to turn that tide around. So what can Morocco do quickly?
Well, quickly, I think it's continue on the path of diversification. There is lots of potential of the service sector in Morocco, lots of potential for tourism, a sector that has been growing over time. Lots of potential for Morocco to also continue exporting some of the services that it offers, and lots of potential in the growing telecommunication sector. I think this is where some of the revenues and some of the backbone of the economy can fall in the advent of a drought, which reduces cereals and so many other economic shocks that can hit the country.
Okay, thank you so much for joining us, Mtwalo Msoni. He's a member of the International Tax Justice Academy, as well as the current tax advisor at Action Aid in South Africa. We look forward to having you back, but thank you for your time today.
Thank you. Thank you
so
much. Pleasure.
So we will be moving on to wrap things up on NC4 to watch, and that is, of course, what's coming up to you now. And let's get straight into it. These are a few business stories we're keeping our eyes on here on Business Edge. 10.5 billion rand, not enough for South African Airways. Woo, Nelly. South African Airways administrators have announced that the money owed to aircraft lessors and those who have leased the aircrafts and some creditors of South African Airways is not covered by 10.5 billion rand government bailouts released late last month by the government. Will South Africa continue to funnel money into South African Airways? Second on our list, Kenya's central bank has raised 27.6 billion Kenyan shillings in T-bills auction. The central bank accepted bids worth that amount from this week's Treasury bills auction out of 24 billion Kenya shillings that was offered. This represents a subscription rate of 115.93%. Nigeria's Central Bank Securities and Exchange Commission okays GT Bank holdco structure. Now, the Guarantee Trust Bank PLC has obtained the approval in principle from the Central Bank of Nigeria and the Securities and Exchange Commission to commence the formal process of the reorganization of the bank to a financial holding company. And finally, staying in Nigeria, the Nigerian government is to continue oil exploration in the Lake Chad Basin area. The government announced that the crude oil exploration in the Lake Chad Basin will continue soon. Oil exploration was suspended by the Nigerian government in July of 2017 after suspected Boko Haram sect members attacked a team of geological engineers from the University of Maiduguri. They were engaged by the Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation to carry out a survey of the Lake Chad region in Borno State towards the commencement of oil exploration. And that's it on this edition of Business Edge. As always, thank you so much for joining us. Head to our website and you can find more business stories on that place. And of course, follow us on social media at News Central TV. Until next time, I'm Tolulope Adeleru Balogun.